Hi, everyone. Today I'm joined by James Cussen. James runs the YouTube channel, The Living Philosophy, and I've been super interested and excited about the work that he's been putting out over there. He has a fantastic video on metamodernism, and I'll put a link to that in the description and highly recommend that people check that out. But also doing some really fascinating videos on integral theory. I think you've got a video on the quadrants that's got like 100,000 views.
It's
It's a
really,
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 yeah, excellent job with all this stuff. But this is also just sort of the tip of the iceberg. I mean, you get into the whole philosophical tradition. Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, I think, is on there, all the way back to Aristotle and the and the academy and everything. So it's all in there. Continentalist analytics, philosophy. So yeah, I just wanted to touch base with you because you're clearly a very brilliant mind and interested in metamodernism. And no, it's true
that's
though. I
good.
mean, you do a great job really articulating these really complex ideas and distilling them
Thank
and
you.
communicating
Yeah.
them. So and the communication factor is also really key, and I'll touch on some of my thoughts about that maybe in the course of the conversation. But yeah, I see you as someone really engaging really intelligently with this metamodern space, and wanted to touch base and maybe get the word out about your channel and just you as a thinker. So
Sure, I really
anyway,
appreciate that. Yeah.
yeah. So thank you very much for being on here.
Yeah, it's an absolute, it's an honor. I've been watching a few of your episodes over the last couple of days, and yeah, just like the quality of like interaction that I'm just like, oh, this is amazing. This is
Thank you.
really, really great stuff. So it's yeah, it's an absolute privilege.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. A segue into getting into the meat of the ideas. I'm curious. I mean, how did you uh, I don't know, start to get into this material, but specifically, I mean, how did you find metamodernism? What attracted you to it? And I mean, you've in your metamodernism video, you begin by saying metamodernism might be the most important idea you encountered this year, and you say it's essential
Mm.
for the problems we face today. So I mean, you're really going to bat for this sort of
Yeah, I
paradigm.
guess
So
so. Yeah.
yeah, I'd be curious to hear what your how you kind of came to all this, and yeah.
Yeah, so with Integral, it's a funny thing. So I was in Australia about 8 years ago and was doing this thing called HelpX where you work for your food and board. And I stayed with this semantics teacher, and he just introduced me to like loads of just amazing thinkers I hadn't come across before. And there was too many for me to dive into at that point. So there was like Brene Brown, there was Osho, there was Ken Wilber, and he's quoting from all these different people. And I was coming from, I just finished like my degree in philosophy. So this was a kind of a whole new world for me. Now I'd been into spirituality before, but just these thinkers I'd never really come across. And yeah, so Ken Wilber was on my radar then, but I was just like, oh, he's someone that I'll need to study at a future point. Like that's something I'd like to study in depth. And then just a couple of years back, I went off, I just hiked the west coast of Ireland, just kind of like the lockdown, you're off a leash. And so I just walked from Limerick down just all the peninsulas down to the south of Ireland.
Uh,
And then just afterwards, I just had this moment in a bookshop, secondhand bookshop, and there was a brief history of everything, and I was just like, oh, I just read that, and I was like, oh my god, this is just absolutely amazing. And I'd been coming out of like years of being in a very, very Jungian place, but I had a friend send me Hansi Freinacht, send me the Listening Society, been like, you need to read this. I read a little bit, I put it away, and then I think I must have read Ken Wilber and then come back to it and been like, all right, this is fantastic. So there's just so many nuggets running through it, and just the whole idea of the fact of we're coming into a meta-modern time. It's just so many things just clicked for me with the meta-modern idea that I was like, this is incredible. Like, and as well, there's so much like hatred towards postmodernism. And it was something in the integral, and especially in metamodernism in the listening society, of let's integrate this as part of the journey forward rather
right.
than pitting one side against the other. And so it's this just digesting more and more traditions and being like, okay, let's not just run into polarities that are drifting further apart, but let's try and learn more and more from, like, what's that Wilbur line about nobody's smart enough to be wrong all the time, is it? I was just like, yeah, that's like brilliant. And it's just that idea of just taking curiosity rather than certainty. And yeah, so that was just an attitude that really resonated with me, and that I've always kind of been drawn towards. And then with metamodernism, that thing of like, well, let's be curious, what can we do with this? And even the whole thing of like, we're creating models, but we're holding them lightly. It's the thing of like, we need to try, and we know we're going to fail, but we need to try. And I was like, well, this is what we need now, because it's so hard. Like, coming through the Jungian thing, it was a lot of like thinking about new religions and thinking about the time that we live in as being kind of a pivotal time, in the same way that we'll say the time of the ancient Greek philosophers would have been, that the old religion had lost its grip on the psyche. And so there's this interim phase, because I always think it's going to be an interim phase of like atheism or of a kind of agnosticism before the new religions are born, before the gods reawaken, or people become recognizant of the gods. So thinking of this time that we live in as that, and then metamodernism kind of in, well, let's explore that, and let's see, try and create things and then see what sticks, kind of thing. So there's so much in it that resonated for me that I couldn't help but be intoxicated by it.
Well, there's so much there that I'd actually really like to get into. That I want to come back to that idea of sort of this lull, this liminal period of atheism or agnosticism before the gods reawaken. That is very interesting to me, and I'd like to hear, you could maybe link some of that to the philosophical history. Considering the philosophical tradition, do you think that these ideas are going to be part of the sort of the history of Western philosophy going forward?
The great conversation.
Or are they more tangential, or how do you fit them into that sort of narrative?
That's a really good question. How would they fit into? Because it's I have difficulty with that question, because it's very hard, and I don't know whether this is a thing of like, it's easy to pick out the skyscrapers when you're 100 miles or 20 miles outside of a city, but when you're downtown, it's very hard. So like being within the time period, it's very hard for me. Like, you can see that Zizek is going to be remembered, but is it going to be as a significant contribution? Chomsky is definitely going to be there as a significant contribution, but yeah, I don't know. Is it possible to know within a time? Yeah, because the thing, and this is part of my own ignorance, is that like, I'm not that up to date with what's going on in philosophy now, if that makes sense. Like I'm still trying to catch up with everything, like with all these other models and ideas that I feel like, okay, if you're going to read Foucault, you got to read, you got to understand phenomenology, you got to understand existentialism, you got to understand Nietzsche. If you're going to understand Nietzsche, you're probably going to want to read Schopenhauer. And if you want to read Schopenhauer, well, you got to read, you want to know what's going on with Hegel, but really you got to know Kant. If you want to know Kant, you got to know, and it just goes onwards and onwards. Right. So it's just like, just drowning in information. There's so much to know that I'm like, well, where do you even start?
One of the questions I have too about this is, it sort of relates to, how does this relate to the field of, say, like academic philosophy? Because I'm of the view that, and I have some friends doing PhDs in philosophy, and in fact, I almost went that route myself briefly. And so I'm a little bit aware of some of the stuff that's kind of happening in that space, but none of it is exciting and as compelling to me as like these ideas, which I see as happening generally outside of academia. And I find that an interesting dynamic as well, in terms of, but even as I say that, I'm thinking, well, have academic philosophers, to what degree have they necessarily been the ones carrying that torch or moving things
forward? I mean,
forward?
Nietzsche was completely outside that tradition, right? And
right.
Schopenhauer, as far as I know, was outside that tradition. Kant kind of nestled himself within it. So yeah, I don't know to what extent those thinkers now, the French postmodern philosophers, obviously they were, and the Frankfurt School are obviously very much academic thinkers. But yeah, I don't know. So when I went to study philosophy, like, it was in an analytic school. So are you aware of the Analytic Continental? So it was in an analytic university in Scotland. And I was just like, this what is this? Like, this isn't. I'd been reading Camus, I've been reading Nietzsche, you know, I was all about, like, so Nietzsche has this line that to the philosopher nothing is impersonal, whereas to the scientist there's this little box called the will to truth, and it doesn't matter where in the field of knowledge that they put it, it's just that's the thing and it takes away. Whereas to the philosopher nothing is impersonal. And then I got to university and I was like, I don't understand what's going on here. I felt very much out of place, and it never grabbed my attention. And now I regret that. Now I wish I'd interacted with it more, but definitely I had this distaste for what I saw as the impracticality, that philosophy was divorced from life in a way, that it had just become this intellectual puzzle rather than something that you lived and breathed. And yeah, it's just, I guess I was connected more into like the ancient tradition, but very much Nietzsche is part of that as well. And there are living philosophers that kind of go throughout and for Jung, obviously with the psychologist, it again becomes imminent. The French, like I think the continental tradition, I would have felt much more at home with, because while it's not necessarily like spiritual or working on yourself in a way that I feel like Nietzsche was doing, it's very political. It's at least engaged in what's going on out in the world, and is trying to create a change out in the world. Now, some of that is questionable.
Right. I mean, it seems like the choice is sort of between a kind of dry, well, this is maybe unfair. So, and I also, I have friends in the analytical academic philosophy tradition. And so I see up close, like what they're doing, and they love it. And it's, you know, I'm not trying to, you know, diss the analytic tradition per se, but, you know, in a certain caricatured view, you could kind of say there's either the option of kind of a dry analytic, you know, detached sort of, you know, almost potentially even illusory, oh, this is truth, and you know, or if you're not into that, then sort of the continental thing, which is just going to be political and kind of very easily kind of falls into this I don't know, kind of is prone to maybe some of the darker sides of the, you know, the woke elements in societies, and kind of feeds into that. And it's sort of like, well, where in these two options can I do the stuff, you know, that is the juicy stuff about all, you know. So that there does seem to be a kind of, in my view, kind of an unfortunate bifurcation in academic philosophy along those routes.
And it's taken me time to try and develop a curiosity with that, to be like, I'm now really curious about analytic philosophy and I want to study it more, but it's more because I feel established enough and I feel like I found my tradition, and so I really feel comfortable with what I am. So I'm more like curious about what they're doing. And I think you're right that there isn't really that now psychology kind of hived off a bit of that vein of philosophy, but it's just you're choosing between the academic and dry, or else the highly politicized. But I still think I've been reading a lot of Foucault, and I'm like, oh, this is really good. But I guess it's still more at a cultural level. It's still more, it's not necessarily personal transformation. Although it seems in his later years, and I haven't studied this in depth yet, but he makes the move towards so he's famous for being like, he would map out what was going on with, we'll say, the prisons, the mental health system, but he didn't tell people how to change it. He was kind of just like observing the system, and they were like, but like, give us a solution, give us something to work with. You're just someone that's criticizing and you're not doing anything constructive. And it seems like in his last years in the 1980s, he was actually he was studying Stoicism and the works of Pierre Hadot. So he's getting much more into, by transforming yourself, that's how you by ripple effect transform the society. So it seems even there it's moving into that.
But didn't he also in his later years kind of take this sort of neoliberal turn? Like I've heard critiques of late Foucault as being sort of like, oh yeah, he kind of just became this like individualistic kind of I don't know, Reagan era philosopher or something.
So I was reading a few articles about that, because I was like, that's a juicy take, like the combination of like Foucault, the starling of like of the woke left, and then neoliberalism, like the complete antithesis to that, and just like how those went together. And I'm curious to find out exactly why, but it seems like it was a playfulness. It seems like he was kind of like, well, because neoliberalism was still very young at the time, so it wasn't like a highly, it wasn't clear what the downstream effects were going to be. But I think for Foucault, where he was at philosophically, he was kind of like, oh well, let's play with this and see how these things go together. So I mean, I think definitely when the woke left are looking at him, they're more looking at the 1970s and his fixation on power and more the collective internal things that's going on in society. Whereas, yeah, by the 1980s, he seems to be moving more into that internal individual. And you wonder whether is that to do with his, his confrontation with death. So is that like he's kind of staring down the barrel of this, he knows he's going to die, and maybe that shifted his philosophy a bit. So I'm curious to study that. Yeah.
Well, just to jump back to that academic issue too, I wanted to point out, because this ties into something I mentioned earlier, that, I really feel, for good or ill, that a lot of sort of the introductory material people are going to be getting to philosophy, ideas, is increasingly going to be coming through YouTube channels like yours. People are going to be digesting this stuff not in a seminar or classroom context. They're going to be getting these 12 or 15 or 20-minute clips on these things, at the very least at sort of an introductory level, to kind of, whet their appetite or just kind of plant the seed. And so again, that's just an element that I keep seeing over and over again that I feel like hasn't really been taken seriously by institutional thinking. I guess it makes sense because it's kind of a threat in some ways, but and I say that for, again, it really is for good or ill, but channels like yours, I think, are very much for good, right? Like this is it's an introduction to these ideas in a very kind of helpful and nuanced way, and these are the things that I think are kind of coming down the pike increasingly. And so the role of the academic philosopher, the role of, the professor or some kind of institutional figure being at the vanguard of, intellectual history, those days seem to be shifting, at least, if not something in the rearview mirror. And I'm increasingly kind of wondering how all that's going to pan out.
The future of academia is an interesting like where that's going to lead is an interesting question. I don't think that what people like me are doing on YouTube is any threat, because it's such a brief skimming, and I think if anything it's good because it'll give you just a taster of the different traditions, the different things that are out there, but without, like, really, if you want to go in depth and you want to study these things, university, academia is still a wonderful place. And as well, I think it will take a long time for them to try and enter this sphere, because they're just like, it's when you're an entrenched institution, there's an inertia, it's going to take time before even the individuals within that might begin to become aware of it. But the time between, like, first of all, it's going to take them time to become aware of it, and then it's going to take time for the institution to, like, slowly shift. But I mean, that's always like the time for disruption. So I guess there's God only knows what will happen, but as it is now, I don't think that there's any real threat to academia from what we're doing.
No, I agree. And the threat wasn't so much that, like, hey, YouTube clips about philosophy are going to displace or, make obsolete entire philosophy departments, as much as to say that I think that the sort of material, at least, that you get to cover outside of an academic context, like, you're not going to enter even a philosophy 101 class and hear anything about Wilbur or hear anything about, metamodernism for some time, I think. And I think you're right. Like, there will be, I think, a readjustment, and it takes time for these things always, to kind of find their way into those contexts. But in the meantime, it's sort of like, these are the platforms where these things are being really explored, and I think that in some way there is a kind of classroom element, a kind of digital academy, really, actually, that is out there, that is sort of extra academic, and yet has its own vigor or rigor and its own, but a lot more openness and a lot more kind of freedom to explore ideas that just aren't.
And the way I'd see it as well is that, like, I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination, so I feel like it's a journey people are taking with me rather than a lecturing situation. It's I'm going to go off and study this topic for a week or a few weeks, and then I'm going to, share my findings. So it's more like a pioneering mindset of, like, let's see what's out there and let's see what the big ideas are and let's see what we can discern from them. So it's more of I see it more of, let's take a journey together, rather than I'm pontificating or I know what's going on. Right. Because yeah, and this is, I think it's an important shift for me, because it's like, that's really fulfilling for me, because I'm like, I want to learn more about these things, and I've always felt like, well, there's so much to learn, and yeah, how can you bring people along with that, so that they're traveling with you on the journey, rather than showing up one day and being like, hey, I've read all the books, I've got all the knowledge. Whereas I'm getting feedback along the way for like, people are challenging, every time I'm putting something out, or every time I've had an idea, it's people are challenging me, being like, oh no, you're not seeing it this way, you're forgetting about this thing. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's cool, that's interesting. So it's like hypercharging my learning, but it's like a shared, and I would like to amplify that in future. I'm still just getting to grips with what I'm doing at the moment, but like, to like long term, the vision was always to found my own school of philosophy. Like ever since I was 17, 18, beginning to read Camus and then reading like the ancient philosophers, I was like, why do we not have like an academy? Why are people not striving to like have these groups of people that are figuring out how to live the best possible life? That just seems like, why do we not have that?
Yeah.
Why
Yeah.
are we teaching people like, and not to like, again, dismiss the value of that, but like, rather than just giving people content, I have a vision for an institution that will, it gives you all the skills, like from the most basic things of like cooking or online savviness, like understanding how technology works. Don't open the emails if it says it's Nelson Mandela's widow. It's like just like basic things, but everything from there up to like the great ideas in the philosophical tradition, and just giving you models, lenses to look through the world to understand it, and then giving you this education. It's like a basic education in living philosophy, and then whatever you apply yourself to from there will, can be something that you're much more successful at, because you're probably much more, you want to be aware of your own psychology, of your own psyche, and your own barriers and pitfalls, because we're just throwing people into educational experiences and we're just being like, sink or swim. You know what I mean? We're not going to do anything with your psychology. We're not going to do anything with the rest of your life. We're just expecting you to show up intellectually, and hopefully you'll figure it out. Hopefully you'll figure out how to write an essay. Like, but it's, yeah. So like, it's frustrating for me, because it's like, I get, in one way it might not seem practical for the workplace, but in another way it's like, of course it is, because you're even if you're looking at things through that lens, just having people that are functional and more functional seems to me to be a very valuable thing. So that idea of the ancient philosophical schools is really appealing to me, and
right.
I think
It's
it's
always
something that,
it's just always one of those things, right, where it's like, it's very hard in some ways on the face of it to make the case about anything, whether it's music or the arts or philosophy, to very kind of pragmatic, utilitarian minded folks, as being, yes, this is this will give you your good ROI, right? Because it's like, oh, this all just seems very, wishy-washy, and but who needs philosophy? We need, but it's also like time and again, repeatedly been the case, right, that these sort of investments up front make you, they're going to give you more civic minded people. They're going to make you wise, give you wiser people, and all. If you could actually, I think it's possible. I don't know what you'd use to do this, but I'm sure you could convert that actually into like a very utilitarian argument, in the sense of, look, we're wasting billions of dollars on people just not living well in the world in all these different ways, that if a proper educational system were in place, like, so.
Well, I mean, it's becoming a thing with the mental health crisis, though. People are realizing that, like, oh, there's a severe cost to mental health, and maybe we want to start thinking about this, and maybe like just putting up a poster in the office is probably not going to solve people's mental health problems. So how do we actually, like, I think that the mental health crisis is kind of a good way of getting into it and being like, well, let's start to think about, where, like the fulfillment and the mental stability of people plays a part in that greater workplace. Because I guess it's not been looked at that way. It's just been like, no, what productivity am I getting from my workers? And it's like, well, I mean, you got to figure out how people function. So, and but then that's kind of an externality for businesses. So it's like, well, that's a society thing. So how do we do that?
It seems like we live in this modern world that still have all these kind of modernist pathologies to them. And then the postmodernists came along, and as you were saying about Foucault, kind of pointed it all out, but didn't necessarily have any, okay, what do we do now? And now it's like, shockingly only now, maybe in the past, what, 5, 10 something years, it seems to me, are like many people starting to say no, like that we need to try to come up with new systems, new structures, and actually change these things. And I think that very much is
Yeah.
that metamodern shift. It's away from just, critique and point out all the problems to like, oh, we need to take a more holistic view of all these things if we're going to solve these
Mm.
really, knotty problems. I'm curious.
And
Just
that's the thing, is that they're super naughty, and that was something like reading Foucault. He's saying like it's because it's so complex. You were talking about, because it's no longer seeing it as this. I can prescribe the solutions to the problems of society. He's like, this has to kind of like, I'm just pointing out the history of this thing, and then the people within those traditions. It's going to take much more than me pontificating and telling how the solution to it all. Like, he has an appreciation for how complex the world is and the emergent complexity of society. And he's like, it would be extremely naive for me to try and prescribe the solution to a societal problem. And I think the Foucault gets a bad rap in that. And I haven't studied Derrida enough or the others to say this, but definitely the idea that they're just doing critique for critique's sake. With Foucault, it's that like we're talking about a hyper complex system. Why do you think that I can understand the entire thing, that I'm like, oh, this is what you got to do? That's like, it's just, it's very naive to think about that. So I think that's where the metamodern thing of, it's just the audacity of metamodern. Just we'll try, we'll fix it. And it's just like, well, the only way we're going to do it is the idea of these experiments, and let's just try and mess about and see what emerges. And I think that is necessary. And I think that is what Foucault wanted anyway, was for people to be making attempts, because there's this idea of experimentation in Nietzsche as well, of just like, you want to try different things out, and we need these micro experiments. I see them, this is the way I would look at it, of like having micro experiments where we can try out different political systems, or we can try out different things and then see what the downstream results are. So it's trying to have a playfulness rather than being like, we need to change everything all at once right now. But I just love the audacity, the gall of metamodernism to be like, like let's pretend like we're those 19th century people that thought that they could understand the world and just prescribe a solution. And then, but also know that we're wrong.
Right,
exactly. But it's like a
exactly.
playfulness as well. You know what I mean? There's something beautiful about that.
Yeah, no, there's that sense that Foucault had too, that, wow, this is a damn complex issue, and we're not just going to be able to have an easy fix for this, but going that next step and being like, that said, we're sure as hell going to try, because we've got to do something, sort of, and that's sort of the sensibility thing. I wanted to ask too, so I'm really interested in your the idea of a school of philosophy, and your thoughts about that and how that might work. I'm just curious if there's like have you thought of what, is there a tentative name for that, or any kind of contours, at least, of what it is?
I don't really have. So actually, a few years ago, a friend of mine sent me on. There was this funding round in Ireland for new businesses, and he was like going for it with a tech thing, and I was like, I should apply for something like that. This is when I was just like searching around, because I decided academia wasn't the route, and I was like, I need to have money in order to study. I want to spend all my time studying, so I need to figure out how I can do that. And so I was just like, okay, School of Philosophy. I'm gonna pitch them a School of Philosophy. And the idea I had was like, okay, let's just take a module on fear. Let's just start with a module on fear. So fear is something we'll all run into so much in our lives. It keeps people in bad situations, and it keeps them from going towards greater ones. And I had this idea of just having like biofeedback of just, okay, if you're, let's just incrementally, so even just below the threshold of consciousness, keeping track of like what's going on in the body and seeing how your fear reactions are, and just pushing the boat out so you get more and more accustomed to fear and you can overcome your fears. And just this idea of like, fear is such a basic thing that's part of our lives, but other than like Susan Jeffers, feel the fear and do it anyway, it's not really something that we get any advice around. It's just like, be courageous, like Snoopy the dog or whatever. It's just it does not really how can we master fear? And it's just I just see it as being something as basic as that, of let's have a module on fear where we help you talk about what you're afraid of, and then we get you to encounter with your fear. Or Yeah, so like I've had so many different ideas for what the different modules would be, even from like sleep, just like understanding how that you need sleep, figuring out how much sleep you need, figuring out how your sleep cycles work, and kind of like getting into a hacking of finding your best rhythm with sleep and with health, with you're looking after your body. So I see it as getting into like really basic things and just really just optimizing for the best life. But then there's also, I love all these different typographical systems. So whether it's spiral dynamics or Myers-Briggs or the Enneagram or just anything that like classifying who you are and just using that to get a little bit more knowledge of yourself, to get a bit more knowledge of your blind sides. And then with Jungian work, just getting into your unconscious and becoming aware of like, yeah, just your shadow and becoming well acquainted with that and seeing where that's going to bubble out. So yeah, I see it as, again, start with something basic like fear of just like, okay, this is something that's really practical, something we all come face to face with. And then, yeah, moving through the really basic things. So like the lower levels, we say, of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And then kind of building that foundation so that when you move into the higher realms of consciousness or of self-actualization, that we just want to get you there quicker. So you have your basis sorted out and
Yeah.
and then we can talk to you about, so it's like layers of esotericism then of just like, well, do we want to take you into, because there's this whole idea that maybe Plato's Academy, the dialogues were just the exoteric teachings, and there might have been this deep esoteric thing going on. And it's like, well, once you have the school and once you're teaching people the basic things, well, wouldn't it be interesting to explore the deeper realms of consciousness? So like what Wilber was doing, well, I'd see meditation anyways being a part of it, but what Wilber was doing with messing with the brainwaves is just like, okay, what if we can get people to try out different spiritual things, to try out like deeper levels. So it's a thing of how deep do you want to go with the school of philosophy, and then trying to have that and trying to have it. Yeah. Because I have to think of like the business side of it as well, of like, where is the funding going to come from? So it's coming from people coming in, but then you also, the people you want to help are people who are young, who are just setting out in the journey. So well, I'm always trying to think of the practical elements as well.
This very much just seems like it's just dovetailing so much with what I'm hearing around conversations about wisdom, but like, yeah, the need for like wisdom schools, basically. There's this proliferation of knowledge, or at least information, but just a dearth of wisdom, which is what it seems like you're really getting at, which when I think of living philosophy, I think what captures that is just is wisdom, and we lack wisdom traditions, and we lack a wisdom pedagogy that can bring all these things into our lives in a meaningful way. And these need to become institutionalized in some way, right? They need to be, that gets into the funding issue and all this stuff, but it's like, it's very hard to be doing this stuff where it doesn't exist yet, and to somehow try to make it part of the fabric of society almost.
Yeah, and that whole thing, because that's what philosophy means. It's philosophia, it's the love of wisdom. And so for me, that was it. I had this thing about it become philoscientia, it become love of knowledge, trying to move towards that direction. But really, it just comes back to that for me. It's the love of wisdom. And yeah, you have to figure out how do you ground that. And if you look back to the ancient philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, where Plato was an aristocrat, and then Aristotle was fantastically and fabulously rich because he taught Alexander the Great, who just gave him, who made him filthy rich, and he came back and could just throw money at the idea of a school. So like, how do we do that in a metamodern age? And I think, it's a curious problem, and seeing how that's going to fit in. And can you look to the church? I don't think anyone's going to be tithing the living philosophy, out of their earnings, but figuring out how to. And I think you only know by trying to just take the next step and take the next step. And that's the thing with emergent complexity, because there's an appetite for it that's out there. So these things all the parts are kind of there, and we can see we're down the whirlpool, because this recognition of what wisdom is and the importance of wisdom, and you throw in the mental health crisis and the meaning crisis, and then all of a sudden it's starting to click that like, oh, we need something else. And this kind of comes back to the idea of the lack of religion, and the fact that we're in this liminal time between, having institutions that are pillars of wisdom. So that's, I think we're in that in-between time, and what the next period is going to look like is still forming. So it's there's still a
Yeah.
lot that's out there, which is interesting.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And that, again, what you brought back into that, the religious element or the spiritual element, which again, I see in all of these conversations that happening, whether that's with, Vervaeke or Zach Stein talking about, education and the need for wisdom and all these things. There's a kind of shared understanding that there is a spiritual grounding that is also missing, which is also then intrinsically difficult to incorporate in a modern kind of paradigm, or at least in a world that is so governed by modern paradigms, where there's sort of oh no, you can't talk about spirituality or these sorts of things in a public context, which has a lot of good reason for doing that. But then it's like, wait a second, if we're basing schools on stuff that kind of just from the get-go eschews the ability to integrate that with a deeper spiritual, or at the very least kind of even deeper psychological grounding, we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot for trying to have a wisdom society. But yeah, I want to ask you another kind of impossible question, which is sort of then, if that is the case, right? I mean, how would you articulate the spirituality that gets taught in that context, right? Like what is, I mean, I would assume that the kind of spiritual grounding and religious grounding that you're talking about, isn't going to be, okay, we all just need to read, the Bible for 8 hours a day or something, right? It obviously isn't that. So then it's sort of like,
oh, it is that. It's actually, it's all just a front for starting a new Christian cult. If I'm being honest, you got me. I can't lie.
All right. Well, now that we've really opened that up, let's dive into that. Because but yeah. So if it's not that, then what is it? How would you kind of summarize the spiritual inclination that gets explored in this sort of wisdom space?
Yeah, and I mean that's something that's interesting, because it's what I see is missing isn't actually, I don't see the spiritual element as being what's missing now, because I think that the spirituality is actually something that's very much alive and well, and it's if anything, it's doing better. It's the religious element that seems to have completely disappeared, and it's and this is what you, John Vervaeke and Lehman Pascal were kind of like trying to explore, was how do we, like, what is this new religion going to look like, and how to bring in the communitarian aspects, or to make it applicable to to society at large, rather than just to the small esoteric group of people, because there's still room for the esoteric teachings. There's a lot of people, and a lot of them are cults, but there's a lot of people that are genuinely teaching people to reach higher levels of consciousness. And it's more the thing that's knitting society together, and is a community element that is bringing a watered down version of that, or is providing a starting point for a spiritual tradition, because that's what religion was. You start with, you've got the Bible, and depending on where you are in your life, you're going to church on Sunday. In medieval times, you're just like, oh, this is grand. I don't actually think about it because I'm in a comfortable period in my life. But then when you reach a period of like grief or of extreme challenge, then you've got this deep wisdom tradition to turn to, which can sustain you. So religion is like it provides a starting point where you can be at a low state of depth, like, to use that like Hansi Freineck framework of state and depth. And so you can start with that shallowness, but then when you need it, there is that great depth. And I guess that's something kind of like what I was talking about with the idea of a school of philosophy there, where maybe you just need to learn how your sleep patterns and how to, get exercise. And maybe that's all you need for now. And this ties in with the Jungian idea of, I actually can't remember where Jung says this, but he says if someone came to him that was below like 38, he would just send them to Freud. He was just like, oh no, this isn't what analytical psychology is about, because analytical psychology is about the midlife transition. It's about the awakening of the underworld. It's about this kind of like second adolescence of the collective unconscious awakes, and instead of an aspect towards life, there's an aspect towards death. So it's facing into the eternal problems. Whereas up to Len, he was kind of like, if you're having problems, you're maladjusted to the world. So you need to go to the Freudians and they'll help you to adjust to the world. So that'll be those basic things of like sorting out your mental health, and maybe you don't want to go deeper. But there are people, and it seems like more and more people that have an increasing hunger for more depth. And so maybe it's going back to like philosophical schools, because if you looked back to the last liminal period, there was the Epicureans and the Stoics and the academics and the Peripatetics. So you had all these different schools of philosophy. And in Christianity, Nietzsche said Christianity is Platonism for the masses. You know, it was this tradition that emerged from the Judaistic tradition, but then through St. Paul, it merged into this more, it merged with Greek philosophy and became something that fitted across the Roman world. So there was a hunger for it in Rome, but then it needed to have, the philosophies weren't enough because they didn't have maybe they didn't have enough exoticism of the metaphysical. So maybe these philosophical traditions can be the beginning, and these conversations, metamodernism and integral, and these are ways of getting it started, but then we'll see something will probably just grip the collective. But see, the thing, this is the problem with living in a world that's as globalized and hyper-connected as ours, is that like, it's very hard for a new religion to be born because there's so much cynicism and knowledge that we have that is like, well,
this is obviously, the thing that is most kind of compelling to me about all this, because on the one hand, I feel like that's another thing that the metamodern context allows for now that wasn't really possible before when the cynicism was much more amped up. Because now in a space of sort of sincere irony, you're sort of able to do it playfully in a way that kind of gives more room for something like that. And I don't think that was always the case. That's my hope. But this also does get at, this thing that I wanted to touch on, and in some ways ties back to this question I had about that lull period of kind of, liminal atheism and agnosticism before something kind of grabs the collective imagination again. But it's also tied to the whole challenge of novelty in religion, right? How does there come to arise new scriptures, or symbols, right? This seems like such a daunting issue, and it's like, but there are examples of it from the past. I mean, that is what happened with, the rise of Christianity in Europe, is that basically, there was this whole colossal cultural shift from paganism to Christianity with that liminal period of, sort of uncertainty, looking around for new faiths, a kind of almost decadent, longing for something new, and the esotericism or the exoticism, looking into the Hermetic stuff and the stuff coming out of Egypt and all this, Osiris cults, all that stuff, right? It's sort of percolating and then sort of lands with Christianity, and then okay, now we're off to the races again. And it seems like, yes, we're kind of at that moment, but like, how do we do that step, especially now when, culturally speaking, or at least in the cultural paradigm that we're in, we're not really working with as much traditional sensibilities. We're working a lot more with traditional modern sensibilities and postmodern sensibilities. So it's like, it seems like an impasse, and it's like no one necessarily, like, everyone can kind of diagnose the problem, but no one necessarily wants to or is able to stick their head out and be like, well, here's a Bible, well, here's a scripture, because it's like, then, who are you and what are you doing? And
but this is where I actually see Jung and the works of like Joseph Campbell and the Jungians as being very interesting, because they point to something. And I think Wilbur was actually off with his criticism of Jung, because the way he talks about the archetypes, like, but I think that like the Jungian analysis of myth and the Jungian analysis of the unconscious and the collective unconscious is actually a very promising thing for like seeing it gives us somewhere to turn to form a relationship with this thing. And this is something that, like, with Nietzsche, that I feel like Nietzsche got very wrong, which is he was talking about, let's do a revaluation of all values. And he thought, I am the one that's going to do the revaluation of all values. And then you're just like, well, this is just like Marx kind of like prescribing a solution. And this is what Foucault's backing off from. But I think that Jung goes, well, like, it's a revaluation of all values is possible, but it doesn't come from the ego. It comes from the unconscious, it comes from the collective unconscious. So new values will bubble up, and it just happens to come through the pen of an individual, but it's a collective thing.
Yeah.
And so this is something I did a video after doing the video on the 4 quadrants, where I was kind of exploring this idea of the collective internal, and can we form a more conscious relationship with the collective internal, because we've got a pretty good handle on the individual internal and reaching higher levels of spiritual consciousness, but it just seems like we're just completely unconscious at a collective level. And does it even make sense to talk about consciousness at a collective level? Because I don't know what that means, but there's this collective unconscious, and it seems like there's something that can come through it, out of which new values can be born, out of which the transformation comes, but it's not something that individuals can just be like, I'm going to do this, and this is what it's going to look like, because it's not a blueprinting, because it's something that's bubbling up, and it's just finding there's a few people that are sensitive, that are lightning rods for it, and it can come up through them. So I think that's happening, that the new values are being born, and the muses are there speaking into the ears. And the question is to what extent that's a metaphysical thing, and to what extent that's just an unconscious thing. And that's another thing. How do we form this relationship with the collective? What is the collective internal? And that's something this is where I feel like the integral and the Jungian has merged for me, because that's the big question of, and it's the Nietzschean question, how do you revalue all values? What does that look like? And that's kind of just what I'm starting to see these things connect for me. And in my next video, I'm exploring the idea that feminism hasn't happened yet, that like we had women brought into the masculinist paradigm. So the historical feminist movements were actually just womanism that was actually bringing women into a masculinist paradigm, whereas actually the feminine values have never been lower in value. So like if there was a revaluation of all values, well, maybe rather than bringing women into a masculinist paradigm, it's actually equating the masculine and the feminine, and giving value to within society to roles of care and to family and to community again, which is again ties back into those religious instincts. So this is kind of something that I'm just starting to explore, but it's something that it's everything that I've been studying up to now is kind of clicking with this, and I'm just like, seems so important, because this is the revaluation of all values. This is the future religion waiting to be born. So how do you do that, and what's it going to look like?
I love that's so, it gets my mind all percolating. I mean, one thought real quick is just, I do think that the kind of quadrant map does a good job at just sort of representing or visualizing the idea that whatever is going to be happening in the collective eternal is going to be linked up with other things that are happening in the individual. Right. So like, as things are changing, it's sort of like they're changing in concert with the institutions that are coming online and the things that are happening in people individually, and the stuff that's happening at all these sort of external and internal levels, both individual and collective, as society itself is shifting. And that's why a Foucault says, hey, here's a system I can point out, but I can't do anything about necessarily, because it's like, here's this whole collective thing that's happening. But then I'm really,
that was something with my approach to it. I very much moved away from Wilber's thing of like, it's all holons, that it's four sides of the same holon. I kind of took it as, let's just play with it as if these are different boxes that are not, that necessarily it's not four faces of the same individual. So that was something that almost I've just gone off and played with and have forgotten for Wilber, of course, it's always interconnected. And I guess for me, I was just like, well, let's focus in on more, if we just took this to the side. So you're very right.
Well, but I wanted to dig into this because I'm really intrigued. You say that one of your critiques of Wilber is his idea of or how he views the archetypes, Jung's archetypes. And so I'm really intrigued by that, because I found his reading of the archetypes to be really helpful for me. But I'd love to have this kind of problematized, because I always found it really itself problematic that when you dig down into the unconscious, kind of what you're finding there are the waters of chaos and the inchoate, these drives, these forces, and there's this sort of kind of untamed and very kind of primordial element. One of the things that Wilber really draws out, right, is sort of like, no, let's really take evolution seriously, and that means that kind of stuff that happens earlier on is going to be simpler and less complex, and therefore less conscious and less whole. And if you really take that seriously, then the archetypes are going to be simpler and cruder, than what we're kind of aiming towards. And so that was my understanding of his critique, was that Jung is wrong to say that basically, we come from out of that, and we're kind of going to go back to it, and that's sort of the ultimate source of things. Because if that were the case, then we're just drawing on sort of our most basic of elements rather than our highest of qualities. And so, and when I mapped that to kind of my own personal experience, my own understanding of mythology, my own, engagement with these sorts of topics around, the unconscious and stuff, that seemed to make a lot of sense. But is that what you take issue with, or what would be?
So I think So I haven't fully developed this, so bear with me a second. So there's two ways of looking at the Jungian archetypes, and is that like Jung in one sense talks about it as it's the inside of our instincts. And this is what Wilber's criticizing, is that like it's an evolutionary thing. It's an evolutionary storehouse of all the lessons that we've learned ancestrally. And so Wilber's point is that like, well, we can't look back for where we're going to go forward. So that's like if you take Jung as just being an evolutionary thinker, but then there is this whole, and I think Jung tries to hold us back a lot, his metaphysical side. And it's more that the archetypes are projecting forward, and that it's not actually just, the collective unconscious isn't just this physical history thing. It's how deep does the unconscious go? Is the unconscious just like a personal experience and a historical experience, or is this a connection to something metaphysical? And the idea of synchronicity as an acausal principle is that it's not actually, we're living in a world that's much more mysterious than the materialist modernist paradigm would have it. So I think Jung kind of was doing the exoteric esoteric thing, and he was kind of playing the exoteric game of like, this is releasing things, but then on the other hand having this highly esoteric kind of teachings, and having this more metaphysical thing which came out in the later years. And I think if you take the archetypes as being something metaphysical, then it seems, because there's that interesting interview with Jung that the BBC did, and your man asks him, do you believe in God? And he goes, I don't believe, I know. And I'm like, what does that mean? Like, where is that? Like, that's a really interesting thing. And that was after his near-death experience, where he had a very, very interesting near-death experience. And like actually where his psyche went in that. And so I think that Jung is more of a metaphysical thinker. And I'm talking to someone else at the moment about animism and about the idea of other consciousnesses being about us, and like the trouble with having just this human-centric conscious, which is also a thing in Integral. We haven't really moved away from the idea of this linear development that culminates in, modern American man. It's this, well, what about the indigenous traditions? Do we just write them off as being, stage purple? And, so that's troubling to me. Like it seems like there's more that we could do there, and it seems like there's other things that we can learn from. And it's one thing that I find troubling with like the Integral, or with the general philosophical trend, is that like this is the culmination of everything. And it's like, well, what if people, like, clearly the spiritual thing and different elements of the spiritual thing have been developed very deeply in other parts of the world. And so maybe they didn't develop this cognitive, or this IQ. I was trying to think who you talked about this. It might have been Zach Stein, that it's not just about this IQ development and this very specific skill set that's led to where we are, technological world, but that could be other cultures that have developed much further in different elements. And we already have that with like the Eastern meditation traditions, that we're like, we acknowledge that they've gone much further than we have. So what if there's more going on than just a human-centric world? Then what if there's the possibility of other consciousnesses? And this woman with the animism thing it's really fascinating to me, but I don't know. Again, I'm very much a creature of the modern age, where I'm just like, I don't really believe in. I'm just kind of like, I have this openness to ideas, and I'm like, let's play around, and what does that mean? And I'm happy to go to the threshold of metaphysical, but I'm just like, I don't know what's beyond. And when people take ayahuasca and they talk about the medicine having a real, there's a presence there, and she's a teacher, and ayahuasca is a feminine teacher, and it's just like, what does that mean? Like what does that, what is going on there? And is there something more that needs to be brought into this, to this vision, to this paradigm of what's going on in the metamodern experience. And yeah, this is again more stuff to explore, but it's all tentative.
I agree. I think then it's all about how do we find the best way of trying to think about what that more might be. Because I'm very willing to accept that our kind of modern framed, localized individual consciousness, et cetera, is like, an incomplete paradigm and obsolete even, and that we need to be moving beyond that. But the alternatives then need to be very carefully weighed, because we could wind up, kind of losing a lot if we go a certain direction and it winds up not being the best one to go in. And so this is why this is
something where I feel like Jung is actually a good thinker for this, because if you take the archetypes in that way as being like, okay, there's more, it's an unconscious that's deeper than the unconscious, potentially. It's potentially deeper than the individual unconscious. Then that gives you a way of being like, well, okay, we can explore internally, maybe we can come to something there. So yeah, that just to finish that point with where the archetypes would fit into that vision.
Sure. Well, and also I wanted to mention too, I haven't read it yet, but I mean to, but Bernardo Kastrup, who does this whole analytic idealism
keep talking about Kastrup.
I know, right? It keeps coming up.
Coming up. I need to read him. Okay.
But he has a book on Jung, basically Jung as a idealistic, like an idealist metaphysical thinker, and kind of maps all that out and kind of brings forward that esoteric element of Jung that you're referring to, that he maybe Jung kind of hid more under these exoteric kind of articulations of his ideas. But anyway, so that's on my big list at the moment.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna read that. Like that's it's just like his name keeps coming up, and it's not just with Jung, it's like with Schopenhauer and stuff. And I just need to read Kastrup, evidently. So I think that sounds fascinating.
But I was just gonna say, I think, what if these sorts of things, just to throw this out, like if you could conceive of this rather than, well, let me point, one thing I think that all this does is, it's really crucial, is that in the topic of this articulation of a new religion, right, is it helps avoid the whole ego problem and all of it, that pitfall nonsense, right? If you're not just a person being like, here's my revelation, or here's my Nietzschean transvaluation of all values, or whatever. It's more of a, I'm just a conduit for something bigger, which has always been what the religious traditions have said. Then this affords a feasible way of thinking about this, and sort of giving cover for these new ideas and images and symbols and myths to bubble up in our metamodern context. But then the question is, are we looking towards our sort of deep unconscious, or some collective unconscious that is primordial and therefore less developed? And then I want to go more in this Wilberian direction of top down. What if Layman Pascal talks about spirituality as being sort of the cohesive, harmonization of all your subsystems, basically, and like the effective ability to do all that, and thinking about God, therefore, as sort of that surplus numinous thing that comes about when people are kind of, there's surplus coherence. There's something bigger emerging out of its various subsystems. And I almost want to think like, what if there's sort of an emergent thing that we're participating in, that we might be able to be in some kind of contact with because we're a part of it. And maybe if you start framing it more in that way, then you avoid the trap of, oh, we're just using regressive old primordial, archetypes. But then you're actually being like, no, I'm actually getting some kind of, I'm tapping into like where humanity's going, where we're evolving towards. And at least conceptually, that's more attractive to me. Whether any of that hangs together physically, metaphysically, whatever, is a kind of a different question. But
yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely not to think of the Jungian thing or the archetypal thing as being just a regressive, or we're just looking at birthing another Christianity, but more as the way authors talk about the muses, the way authors talk about like, this book just poured out of me. Like I sat down and then it was done, and it was this fully formed thing. And that might be a very, that's not going to be like an ancient religious text. That's going to be like, so Stephen Pressfield is one author that talks about this a lot. And it's just like, it's just some days the muses show up, or Elizabeth Gilbert talks about it as well, of this other thing, of this other thing that's kind of like pouring through you, and seeing again, wanting to break down the idea of the individual and being like, well, we're not just the ego, there's a lot of like different moving parts within the psyche, and it's something pouring through. And so it's not just this regressive ancient like Nordic mythology that's going to be coming out, or a new Greek mythology or a new Christianity. It's not just going to be looking something like that, but it will look like something that is tailored to the society that we're living in, because it's still being born through modern or metamodern kind of mind. It's still coming through the conduit and the thing that's required. See, that's the way that I see the collective unconscious, as it's responding, it's alive now, and it's responding to what's going on in the world now. And how do you psychically balance that? So yeah, maybe that can't be done. And I find that Layman Pascal idea very interesting, because it's completely different, and I'd really like to explore that. So he sees it as more like the experience of the whole being greater than the sum of its parts kind of thing. It's like this emergent thing that's coming out on top.
Yeah, that's how I interpret what he's saying. And I think that fits very well with sort of a Wilberian holonic thing, right? That like subparts become, wholes are greater than the sum of their parts, so they keep it transcending and including. So then it's sort of like, what would be the next whole, right? And I guess there are different ways of conceiving that too. It's sort of like, and Wilber talks a lot about the pathologies of potential holarchies and all this sort of thing, right? But if you do think about it as that, then again, there's just it resonates for me, because it's sort of reframed evolutionarily and reframed sort of aspirationally, and kind of provides a certain. It's sort of like, what have we been doing in a part of in our metamodern context, where things are going on and they're all working together, and they're moving, and no individual has a full grasp on that, but there is a kind of whole in which we're participating. And sometimes, when those things cohere in sort of the most integrated sort of way, you can create emergent properties that are greater than the sum of their parts. And if you're aiming towards that, then you're sort of aiming towards your higher self. And that would be, I think, a very apt way of talking about spirituality, and talking about wisdom schools. I feel like that would be a skill set that would be really deeply valuable to have some teaching in.
Yeah, definitely putting those other pieces in place, but it's there's the potential for a teleological bit that I'm worried about there.
Sure. Say more about that.
It's just like, and this is something that I'm not fond of in Wilber, this moving towards this like inevitability of the direction that we're moving. And I don't know, it makes me quite uncomfortable, because it doesn't fit with evolution. Evolution is something that's playful, and this is something that Thomas Kuhn talks about in the Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Of he doesn't believe, and he got a lot of shtick for this, of like, he doesn't believe in truth with a capital T. It's because he says that that's a teleological thing that science would be moving towards, and there's no like one truth. You can't like codify all of truth, and he sees it more through like an evolutionary lens. So it's that there's different possibilities for the way it can go, and you're going to capture different parts of what's out there, and new truths are going to emerge. And it's not to say that it's relativistic, like there are truths that are better at explaining the world and are more functional in the world, but it's not heading towards this one direction of this one codification of the truth. And so it's, if you think of like evolution of life, it's there isn't one life form that all of existence is heading towards. It's a playful interaction between circumstance and intention. And so it's what happens along the way, and unexpected things happen, and then that leads to something new bubbling up. And it's something that I see with the collective unconscious view is that it can be something that's more creative, and it's based on the situation that you're in, and it's this playful evolutionary thing of like, it's not heading in one direction, because again, if you go with the Zach Stein idea, I think it was Zach Stein again, that it's all heading, that like we've just developed in one direction, that it's like this is a choice of the faculties of humanity that we've chosen to develop, but it's not the only one. And there are other cultures that have developed different things. So are we just moving a teleology of like, well, we've come this way along this way, so obviously everything is meant to head that direction, whereas maybe they'd see it differently,
Right.
So,
no, I completely agree. I think teleology is such an important issue, and there's a lot that gets assumed and brought into teleological frameworks, and I don't think all of them are necessary. Some of them might be good, some of them might be bad, but I would say, just on this thought, real brief, the way I tend to think about this is more like, if you look at evolution and you consider things that have evolved independently, like wings, right? There was a certain element in the environmental constraints that allowed wings to work. I was just listening to this fascinating thing about dinosaurs and how dinosaur wings evolved. Like, it took millions and millions of years, and there was no use. I mean, all these various other former versions of the wings had their own individual functions, right? But at a certain point, kind of something with the environment and how that thing had evolved to that point clicked, and then now the thing can fly. And you see that in, like, dinosaurs, but you see it in other winged creatures, and or eyes. I think of eyes the way that. But I mean, take any structure, right, that kind of works and has developed independently. It's not to say that, like, oh, therefore wings are what evolution is aiming at. It just means that there's something about this that works really well given the constraints of the environment that is the background context for all this. And I think you can look at consciousness that way, that sort of once consciousness started kind of getting into the mix more and more, it was like, oh wow, this thing kind of works really well in this arena. And so then you can start to, I think, do the kind of additional question of, like, well, what does that mean? So even if the dynamics of evolution themselves are playful and unteleological, but just sort of always, exploiting the niche that they're in, what does it mean that wings work, right? Like, what does that mean? What does it mean that certain structures, continually work or have some value for an organism? And then if you start thinking about things like consciousness through that lens, I think you can appreciate that there are kind of bigger meta level rules at work almost. And then you can ask questions like, what do those mean? Are those also random, right? Then you can bring it, is there a multiverse? And so this is just how this universe is set up, so evolution works this way here, right? But at least then you're starting to be able to play more intelligently, I think, with the idea of teleology. And anyway, so that's just a little.
Yeah. So this is something guy Teilhard de Chardin, I think, not sure actually how to pronounce it, but he talks about the traditionally when you look at the how things have moved along. There's like the big things, and then there's the small things, so like the quantum level and the macro level. But he talks about like complexity as this progression, and that's something that I find really interesting because it's this other thing that's increasing, but it's not necessarily specific to, like, because you're saying consciousness, but I would say, well, this is a specific type of consciousness, and maybe there's different like elements of. So I think of like Carlos Castaneda, and again, it's someone that I've no idea how to really. I don't know where to put that in my mind, but he talks about consciousness being located like somewhere here, that this is where our consciousness is. It's like almost like a tennis ball of like thing at the edge of our aura or something. If you move that to a different place, then you're in a different state of being. So like, it's a fascinating idea again to explore and to play around with, but it's if you that yes, maybe this particular formation of consciousness is heading that direction, and there could be, this is the way it's going to like play out, but then there's all these other possibilities. So it could be like there are going to be better and worse options. So is that teleology, or is that just the rules of the game? So if you're moving in a certain direction, certain things are going to work, and that's going to have been determined beforehand just by the way the laws of physics work. So so it's possible. It's rather than being like a linear teleology of like everything is heading in this one direction, it's more like, well, we've got different choices of like, it's just this particular thing and this particular way the consciousness is at the moment in this culture is developing in this direction, and maybe that's what. But then that becomes such a limited way that it's not, again, it doesn't provide the great meaning of like, this is what God is, you know what I mean? Like
Sure. No, I mean,
idea, if you limit it that much.
I like the image of lightning. If you think about how lightning or any of these branching fractal structures work, right? But like, especially if you think about how the flow of electricity or something, there's a, the discharge that's seeking to happen there is it's going to find that path of least resistance. It's going to find these different it's going to try different things on its way. Not all of them are going to be the actual point of contact that is going to be the right. So it's like, that's how in my head, that Whiteheadian creativity sort of works. It's lightning moving throughout the universe, trying every option. Some of them work and it goes over here. And then it's like, creating these newer, higher, more complex structures. And then you can look at the whole evolutionary history and see that complexification is also one of these things that is sort of, increasing. And then you can sort of ask, well, is that teleological? What does the increase of complexity mean? But we've gotten really
which is something. Have you heard of Stephen Kaufman? Stephen Kaufman is really interesting.
Yeah.
Or is it Stuart Kaufman?
Stuart Kaufman,
that just like his models of how life actually evolved. I'm just like, oh, that's fascinating, that like this emergent complexity is actually just hard written. That wasn't a complete accident. That was just, there's a whole side of science that we haven't really started to explore fully, and that's just emergent complexity and how what new and wonderful things can emerge out of that. And it's just life happened to click at that one point, and then we've kept it going, but it would have happened and maybe something else could have happened and the branch would have gone differently, which is an interesting thought.
Yeah. This has been fascinating. I enjoy this. Again, you've got a great mind, and I really, I'm just glad that you're in this space and engaging with these ideas. And is there one that we haven't sort of touched on in any of this that you feel like would be pertinent and that you wouldn't want to?
No, I don't know. That was a very non-teleological conversation. Let's just play around. Let's just see where it goes. I like the ideas. Let's see what crops up. So it's I've really enjoyed it. And there's probably a million and one other things we could chat about, but this is enjoyable.
Maybe we can do this again. And I mean, there's a million topics I'd love to dig more into, whether that's Jungian archetypes, contrasting Wilber and Jung, talk about teleology. There's a bunch of juicy things to explore. But I really appreciate you giving your take on metamodernism and metamodern spirituality and all this. And I again highly recommend your channel, The Living Philosophy. I am just kind of curious, maybe this would be a good note to end on. Where do you see kind of your work going? Where do you want it to go? Obviously, you've mentioned like a school of philosophy of some kind, but like, are you sort of, and also speaking of teleology, are you sort of aiming at anything at the moment that you'd like to see be realized in the next couple of years, or It
won't surprise you that I don't. I'm just waiting to see what emerges. That really, I just wanted to get to this point where I've just been searching for something that could provide a vehicle where I can study and go deep into these ideas and just explore, because I don't know. Like the encounter with Nietzsche, the encounter with Jung, the encounter with Wilber, they've all just transformed me radically. So it's very hard to predict where things are going to go. But I think just continuing to explore thinkers, and also it's the kind of trying to reduce polarity in society, or trying to be more and more open. So I think curiosity is one of my highest values of like, let's try and bring more and more in. So a couple of my viewers recommended this guy, Thomas Sowell, who's this like conservative philosopher, and he had this thing of like the conflict of visions. And I was like, oh, it's really interesting to see the world from, because like we're talking about like integral and continental philosophy. Well, what about like right-wing philosophers, or, let's try and bring in all these different perspectives things that don't necessarily mix together. So it's kind of just this alchemy of ideas where I'm just like, let's see what happens when you mix these thinkers that people normally just keep in their different echo chambers. And what happens if you bring those echo chambers together? Does it turn into a harmony, or does it turn into complete discord? So I just want to keep exploring and see what emerges. So there's no real plan other than to just, keep making videos. I'm still very much figuring out my own process and my own, I'm very much in a brewing process. And I just feel like, as I said, the people are along with this journey. And that was something else that Zach said, that like, I was like, this is good, where he's just like, a lot in certain fields, your 20s and 30s are the time when, the big ideas come. In other fields, it's in your 50s or 60s when it's kind of cooked and there's so many layers to it. And I'm like, well, that's good. That's the way that's definitely the way I'm kind of like heading, I think. And ties in with Plato's idea that you shouldn't do philosophy before you're 50 anyway. So we're all getting a head start. So it's just a journey, really, I think.
I like that. Yeah, it's probably a good idea for your hair to be totally gray before you have a philosophy school. That's, it's
That'll
better
be
for
suitable for
better
like
for brand.
Raphael's painting will fit a lot better then,
Yeah,
you know?
there you go. Cool. Well, James Cussen, much appreciated. It's been a joy and an honor, and keep up the good work, my friend. And let's talk again before long.
Thanks a million, Brendan.